She had the loudest, warmest laugh on 1980s television. As the beloved housekeeper on Gimme a Break, Nell Carter was America's indestructible matriarch. Off-screen, that laugh was a lie. Nell Carter was actively dying from a $2,000 a day cocaine habit. The network knew, but instead of an intervention, Hollywood engineered a ruthless cover-up. They weaponized her real diabetes diagnosis as a PR shield, smiling to the press and blaming her drug-induced set collapses on blood sugar. They hid a fatal addiction behind a family-friendly disease, squeezing out every profitable punchline until the funniest woman in America died with exactly $200 to her name. Nell Ruth Hardy was born on September 13th. She was one of 9 children. From the very beginning, her life was structured around the harsh realities of survival, economics, and racial divides in the Deep South. The first profound fracture in her life occurred in 1950. Nell was just 2 years old. Her father, Horace Hardy, was killed instantly when he stepped on a live, high-voltage power line. The sudden violence of her father's death set a baseline of instability that would follow her for decades. In the summer of 1965, when she was 16 years old, she was subjected to a brutal attack. A man she recognized from her neighborhood held her at gunpoint and raped her. The assault was a devastating violation that permanently altered her psychological landscape. The consequence of the rape was a pregnancy. Yet the deepest scar was inflicted in the immediate aftermath by her own family. Her biological mother offered no sanctuary, no protection, and no empathy. Faced with indifference from the woman who was supposed to protect her, Nell was pushed into a corner. She carried the child to term, giving birth to a daughter named Tracy. Unable to raise the child in a household devoid of support and still a traumatized teenager herself, she handed the infant over to her older sister to raise. This decision was a matter of sheer survival, but it fundamentally broke her. The abandonment by her mother and the forced separation from her child destroyed her capacity to trust. From 1965 onward, Nell Hardy operated behind a reinforced psychological wall. She viewed people with intense suspicion, expecting betrayal. She needed an escape, both mentally and geographically. She found it in the underground circuits of Birmingham. By the age of 15, even before the assault, she had started performing. She did not start in polished theaters. She cut her teeth in local coffee houses and underground gay bars. These venues were marginalized spaces, existing on the fringes of a conservative Southern society. For Nell, they offered a temporary refuge and a way to earn cash. It was in these dimly lit, rough-around-the-edges clubs that she honed her voice. It was not refined. It was raw, loud, and forged by absolute necessity. In 1971, she left the South. She changed her name to Nell Carter and moved to New York City. She was entering a grueling, highly competitive theater landscape. For years, she took minor roles, navigated the cabaret circuit, and fought for space in an industry that rarely knew what to do with a short, heavy-set black woman with a massive, abrasive voice. She studied at an acting school, took whatever gig she could find, and relied on the same aggressive survival instinct she developed in Alabama. The turning point arrived in 1978. She was cast in Ain't Misbehavin', a musical revue celebrating the music of Thomas Fats Waller. The show opened at the Manhattan Theater Club before transferring to Broadway. It was an instant, explosive success, Carter did not just perform the songs, she attacked them. Her rendition of Cash for Your Trash and I've Got a Feeling I'm Falling showcased a ferocious talent. She commanded the stage with a mix of aggressive humor and undeniable vocal power. The industry took immediate notice. In 1978, she won the Tony Award for Best Featured Actress in a Musical. She also secured a Drama Desk Award. When the production was later broadcast on television, she won a Primetime Emmy Award. In less than a decade, she had gone from a traumatized teenager singing in Alabama dive bars to Broadway royalty. But this success was a double-edged sword. The Tony Award put a massive spotlight on her. It attracted the attention of powerful television executives in Los Angeles. They did not see a complex woman carrying deep-seated trauma. They saw a highly bankable asset. They saw a booming voice and a sharp comedic timing that could anchor a network lineup. Nell Carter had clawed her way out of the abyss, but her success in New York was merely positioning her for a much more calculated exploitation on the West Coast. In the fall of 1981, the American television landscape was dominated by rigid formulas. At NBC, the network was desperately fighting its way out of the ratings basement. They needed a vehicle that could deliver reliable, broad appeal comedy. They found their answer not in a seasoned television veteran, but in a Broadway powerhouse who had just taken New York by storm. When executives approached Nell Carter, they did not just offer her a role, they offered her the center square of a brand new sitcom, Gimme a Break. The premise was straightforward. Carter was cast as Nell Harper, a sharp-tongued, fiercely loyal housekeeper who steps in to care for the three daughters of a widowed police chief, Carl Kaniski, played by veteran actor Dolph Sweet. On paper, it was a standard family sitcom. In execution, it was a massive cultural and physical undertaking. Carter was not merely a supporting player, she was the gravitational pull of the entire production. The show was built entirely around her specific brand of aggressive comedy, her impeccable timing, and her thunderous singing voice. However, the transition from the theatrical stage to a multi-camera Hollywood soundstage required a fundamental shift in existence. Broadway is demanding, but it is a closed loop. Television in the 1980s was an industrial factory. Becoming Nell Harper meant stepping into a highly specific, historically loaded archetype. As a black woman leading a predominantly white cast, Carter was burdened with the legacy of the mammy figure, the selfless, desexualized, fiercely protective surrogate mother who exists solely to solve the problems of a white family. While the writers attempted to modernize the character by giving Nell Harper a sharp wit and agency, the underlying dynamic remained. Carter was required to exude endless warmth, unbreakable strength, and perpetual maternal energy. This expectation clashed violently with her reality. Carter was a woman carrying the heavy, unprocessed trauma of her past. She was a survivor of extreme poverty, sudden familial death, and a brutal sexual assault. Yet the moment the red light on the camera illuminated, all of that had to be buried. The network demanded Nell Harper, not Nell Carter. The production schedule of a 1980s sitcom was notoriously unforgiving. It was a relentless 5-day cycle. Mondays and Tuesdays were dedicated to table reads and rough blocking. Revisions would come in overnight, requiring actors to memorize completely new pages of dialogue by the next morning. Wednesdays and Thursdays involved intense rehearsals, camera blocking, and run-throughs for network executives. Fridays were tape days, often involving two separate performances in front of a live studio audience, stretching late into the night. For a performer carrying the entire comedic and emotional weight of a show, this schedule was a meat grinder. Carter was in almost every scene. She was required to execute physical comedy, deliver punchlines with precise timing, and occasionally belt out musical numbers. The physical exertion was immense, but the psychological toll was catastrophic. The industry at that time operated with a deliberate blindness toward mental health. There were no human resources departments checking on the emotional well-being of the talent. There were no on-set therapists. The prevailing attitude in Hollywood was entirely transactional. The network pays a massive salary, and the actor delivers the product. Any personal instability was viewed not as a medical or psychological crisis, but as a breach of contract and an inconvenience to the production schedule. As Gimme a Break climbed the ratings charts, Carter became a certified superstar. The show was a commercial success, cementing NBC's Thursday night lineup and securing massive advertising revenue. This financial success created an ironclad incentive for the network to maintain the status quo. Carter was quickly boxed into an illusion. She became the indestructible star. The PR machinery of NBC worked aggressively to curate this image. Press junkets, magazine covers, and talk show appearances were heavily monitored to ensure she presented the same joyful, bulletproof persona as her character. She was marketed as the jovial, tough-loving woman who could handle any crisis with a laugh and a song. Behind the scenes, the pressure to sustain this facade was suffocating. Carter was effectively ordered to suppress her deteriorating mental state. When she exhibited signs of severe stress, exhaustion, or emotional volatility, the network's response was not to offer medical leave or psychological support. Instead, they applied more pressure. Directors and producers demanded she pull it together for the audience. The mandate was clear. The show must go on, and the star must smile. She was isolated within her own success. The executives viewed her as a highly lucrative asset. The crew viewed her as the boss whose mood dictated their workday, and the public viewed her as a fictional housekeeper. Stripped of the space to be a flawed, traumatized human being, Carter found herself trapped in a gilded cage. She was forced to paint on a thick layer of makeup, step out from behind the curtain, and deliver canned laughter while her internal world was slowly collapsing under the weight of an industry that prioritized profit over humanity. The set of Gimme a Break was no longer just a workplace. It was a pressure cooker, and the network's refusal to acknowledge the human limits of their leading lady was slowly lighting the fuse. The environment inside the NBC studios during the production of Gimme a Break was a study in severe contradictions. To the millions of viewers tuning in every Thursday night, the Kaniski household was a sanctuary of chaotic warmth, anchored by a fiercely protective housekeeper who resolved family conflicts with a sharp quip and a booming laugh. The reality on the soundstage was entirely different. The closed sets of the production were defined by intense hostility, power struggles, and psychological warfare. The sitcom that projected domestic harmony was, in execution, a remarkably toxic workplace. This toxicity was not a secret to the crew or the network executives. It was a daily operational hazard that everyone was forced to navigate. The central source of this turbulence was Nell Carter herself. Her behavior behind the scenes stood in stark contrast to the maternal figure she portrayed on camera. She was not a victim of this specific on-set environment. She was its primary architect. The immense pressure of carrying a network sitcom undoubtedly fueled her anxiety, but her response to that pressure manifested in a deeply combative and hostile demeanor toward her colleagues. She weaponized her position as the undisputed star of the show. The power dynamics on a television set are rigid and hierarchical. The lead actor holds the leverage of the entire production. If the star refuses to work, the production halts and the financial losses accumulate by the minute. Carter understood this leverage completely. She used it to dominate the space, often through sheer intimidation. The daily routine on the Gimme a Break set was dictated entirely by her temperament. Crew members, including camera operators, lighting technicians, and script supervisors, reportedly operated in a state of constant apprehension. They learned to read her moods the moment she walked through the studio doors. If she arrived agitated, the entire production schedule was at risk of derailing. The working environment became a minefield where minor disagreements over blocking, lighting, or line delivery could escalate instantly into explosive confrontations. Carter did not subscribe to diplomatic conflict resolution. Her approach was aggressive, loud, and uncompromising. This was a direct extension of the survival instinct she had honed in the underground clubs of Birmingham and the fiercely competitive theater scene in New York. She operated under the assumption that any challenge to her authority was a threat to her survival, and she responded with overwhelming force. The most prominent and consistent clashes occurred between Carter and her co-star, Dolph Sweet. Sweet was a seasoned character actor with a long resume in television and film. He was a former military man, disciplined, rigid, and accustomed to a traditional, professional hierarchy on set. He played Police Chief Carl Kaniski, the patriarch of the family and the fictional boss of Carter's character. On screen, their dynamic was built on a foundation of mutual respect, hidden beneath layers of sarcastic bickering. Off-screen, the bickering was entirely devoid of respect and frequently escalated into vicious, screaming matches. The core of their conflict lay in a massive clash of acting styles and egos. Sweet preferred a structured, rehearsed approach. He wanted to hit his marks, deliver his lines as written, and go home. Carter, trained in live theater and possessing a highly volatile energy, was prone to improvisation, changing pacing on the fly and dominating the physical space of a scene. When these two opposing methodologies collided during rehearsals, the results were disastrous. Eyewitness accounts from the production staff detail numerous instances where filming had to be completely shut down because Carter and Sweet were locked in a screaming argument on the studio floor. Carter refused to be directed or managed by Sweet, deeply resenting any implication that he held equal footing on the show. Sweet, an actor of the old guard, refused to simply capitulate to her demands. This stalemate resulted in hours of lost production time, with the crew forced to watch thousands of dollars drain from the episode's budget. However, this bitter dynamic was abruptly severed by reality. In May 1985, following the completion of the 4th season, Dolph Sweet died of stomach cancer. He had continued to work through his severe physical decline, masking his illness while enduring the highly toxic set environment. His sudden death forced Carter to carry the narrative weight of the sitcom entirely alone, a structural shift that only accelerated her own internal collapse. NBC executives were fully aware of the toxic environment on the set. They received the daily production reports detailing the delays, the arguments, and the escalating tension. However, Gimme a Break was a massive rating success. It was generating significant advertising revenue and anchoring their comedy lineup. In the cold calculus of television production, Carter's behavior was entirely acceptable as long as the final tape was delivered on time and the Nielsen ratings remained high. The studio executives made a calculated decision to enable her hostility. They did not intervene. They did not mandate professional mediation. They did not establish boundaries or consequences for her outbursts. Instead, they placed the burden of managing Carter's behavior entirely on the crew and the supporting cast. The director was essentially tasked with functioning as a hostage negotiator, trying to coax the star out of her dressing room and onto her marks so the network could get their product. This systemic lack of accountability effectively reinforced Carter's worst impulses. The industry taught her that as long as she was profitable, she was untouchable. She could halt production, berate her co-stars, and terrorize the crew without facing a single professional repercussion. The set dynamics deteriorated further when the show attempted to inject new energy into the cast. The introduction of Rosie O'Donnell added a highly combustible element to an already unstable environment. O'Donnell was cast to bring a different comedic flavor to the later seasons, but her arrival immediately threatened Carter's absolute control over the production. O'Donnell was a rising stand-up comedian, highly opinionated, outspoken, and unwilling to simply fade into the background. She was not intimidated by Carter's status or her aggressive tactics. The collision between these two massive personalities was immediate and severe. If the conflicts with Dolph Sweet were rooted in a clash of acting methodologies, the conflicts with Rosie O'Donnell were rooted in a raw struggle for the spotlight and territorial dominance. The dressing rooms at the NBC lot became the epicenter of this new conflict. The proximity of their quarters meant that their arguments were unavoidable. Production staff frequently overheard explosive arguments erupting behind closed doors. These were not whispered disagreements. They were loud, aggressive confrontations that echoed down the hallways. The crew, already exhausted by the years of tension with Sweet, now had to navigate a secondary war zone. Carter viewed O'Donnell as a direct threat to her screen time and her authority. She was fiercely protective of her comedic territory and deeply resentful of any new cast member who might pull focus. O'Donnell, confident in her own comedic abilities, refused to be marginalized or bullied. The resulting friction made rehearsals nearly unbearable. The director had to carefully choreograph their scenes to minimize direct interaction whenever possible, an absurd requirement for a show built on ensemble comedy. The rumors of these dressing room wars quickly leaked to the industry press. Hollywood thrives on gossip, and the reality of two female stars openly fighting on the set of a family sitcom was highly lucrative fodder for the tabloids. However, the true nature of these conflicts was rarely explored in the press. They were often dismissed as typical diva behavior or catfights, a deeply reductive and sexist framing that ignored the underlying psychological reality of the situation. Carter's intense need for control was not simply a manifestation of ego. It was a desperate defense mechanism. She was a woman operating under immense psychological strain. Her past traumas were unresolved. She was navigating the intense isolation of fame. Crucially, as the 1980s progressed, she was quietly losing her battle with severe substance abuse. While the network and the public were kept in the dark about the extent of her addiction, the behavioral symptoms were impossible to hide on set. The volatility, the sudden shifts in mood, the paranoia, and the overwhelming aggression were all classic indicators of an individual whose internal world was collapsing. By exerting absolute tyrannical control over the set of Gimme a Break, Carter was attempting to mask the fact that she had entirely lost control over her own life. If she could make everyone else in the room afraid of her, no one would dare to look closely enough to see how fractured she actually was. The screaming matches, the production delays, and the dressing room wars were all symptoms of a much deeper structural failure. The crew members were the ultimate collateral damage in this scenario. They were working-class professionals, gaffers, grips, sound engineers who relied on the weekly paycheck to survive. They did not have the luxury of storming off the set or demanding a meeting with the network president. They were trapped in a highly dysfunctional workplace, forced to absorb the collateral damage of Carter's emotional explosions and the network's cynical enabling. They adhered to the strict code of silence that governed Hollywood sets. You do not speak out against the star, and you do not complain about the working conditions if the show is a hit. You keep your head down, you do your job, and you try to survive the week. This absolute isolation further entrenched Carter in her destructive patterns. She was surrounded by people, yet she was completely alone. No one on the set was her peer. They were either her subordinates, her rivals, or executives waiting for her to generate capital. The set of Gimme a Break became an island where normal rules of professional conduct did not apply. It was a feudal system, and Carter was the volatile monarch ruling through intimidation while the network collected the taxes. The laughter recorded during the live tapings was a sharp, bitter contrast to the silence that fell over the set the moment the director yelled "cut." The audience heard the punchlines, but the crew lived with the consequences of a production built entirely on a foundation of unmanaged trauma, corporate complicity, and the brutal reality of an industry that treats human beings exclusively as machinery. The dynamic on the NBC lot took a darker turn during the third season. By late 1983, the network faced the standard television dilemma, maintaining high viewership for a sitcom that was settling into a familiar routine. The traditional industry solution was to introduce stunt casting or dramatic narrative shifts during sweeps weeks to artificially inflate ratings. In the case of this production, the executives and head writers did not look outward for a new storyline. They looked directly at their lead actress. They made a calculated, highly unethical decision to mine Nell Carter's genuine physical and medical struggles for comedic material. Her body was no longer just the vessel for the character. It was transformed into the central marketing gimmick of the network's primetime schedule. To understand the cruelty of this strategy, one must examine the contradictory demands placed upon Carter's physical appearance from the beginning of her television career. Initially, she was cast specifically because her heavyset figure fit the antiquated, safe, and highly marketable archetype of the robust, non-threatening maternal caregiver. Her weight was initially an asset to the network, a visual shorthand for the character's designated role within the White household. However, as Carter's internal life deteriorated under the stress of production and escalating substance abuse, her weight began to fluctuate noticeably. Rather than viewing these fluctuations as a severe medical red flag requiring the intervention or a hiatus, the production team viewed them as a lucrative narrative opportunity. The writer's room began drafting scripts that entirely revolved around the character's desperate attempts to diet, her insecurities regarding her size, and the physical consequences of her weight. This was a grotesque violation of boundaries. The writers were observing the very real, very public physical deterioration of an actress and transcribing it into punchlines. Carter was suddenly contractually obligated to perform her own physical humiliation on a weekly basis. The scripts forced her to deliver self-deprecating dialogue regarding her eating habits, to engage in physical comedy that highlighted her size as a punchline, and to act out fictionalized health scares that mirrored her actual, rapidly declining health. The live studio audience was prompted by applause signs to laugh at the precise insecurities and physical ailments that were destroying the actress standing in front of them. The boundary between the fictional Nell Harper and the real Nell Carter was deliberately obliterated for the sake of Nielsen ratings. Carter harbored a deep, visceral hatred for these specific storylines. Eyewitness accounts and later industry reports indicate that she viewed the mandated weight loss narratives as a profound degradation of her dignity. She was a Tony-winning stage actress, capable of immense dramatic and comedic nuance. Yet she was being reduced to a walking sight gag based on her medical reality. The psychological impact of this forced performance was devastating. Every time she was forced to step on a scale for a scene or deliver a joke about her inability to fit into a dress, she was publicly re-traumatizing herself. The network was forcing her to monetize her own physical vulnerability. Despite her intense objections, she possessed zero leverage to refuse the material. The studio system in the 1980s operated on ironclad contracts that offered actors virtually no creative control or bodily autonomy. If the script dictated a diet storyline, the actor was legally required to execute it. Refusal to perform the script as written constituted a breach of contract, which would result in immediate suspension, the halting of her massive salary, and catastrophic legal action from NBC for delaying a multi-million-dollar production. She was trapped by her own financial success. She had mortgages, an entire staff of dependents, and a staggering daily expenditure on narcotics that had to be funded. Quitting in protest was financial suicide. The network executives were fully aware of this leverage. They knew they held the financial upper hand, and they used it to force a vulnerable woman to endure public humiliation, because the focus groups indicated that audiences responded well to the relatable dieting episodes. The marketing department further compounded this exploitation. NBC ran aggressive promotional campaigns leading up to these specific episodes. The network promos isolated the most humiliating moments of physical comedy or the most dramatic admissions of weight-related insecurity, broadcasting them endlessly throughout the week to hook viewers. They framed the exploitation as a relatable human interest narrative. The PR strategy was insidious. They packaged a woman's genuine medical and psychological crisis as an empowering journey of self-improvement for her fictional counterpart. They invited the American public to scrutinize her body, to judge her progress, and to consume her physical fluctuations as entertainment. This strategy effectively removed any remaining agency Carter had over her own public image. Her body was no longer her own. It was network property. This commodification of her physical form exacerbated her existing defense mechanisms. If she was previously combative and hostile on set to protect her creative territory, the weaponization of her weight made her entirely unapproachable. The isolation deepened. She could not trust the writers, who were actively mining her pain for jokes. She could not trust the producers, who were prioritizing the episode's profit margin over her basic human dignity. She was surrounded by a machine that viewed her strictly as raw material to be consumed, processed, and broadcast. The most disturbing aspect of this period was the stark disconnect between the comedic framing of her health on screen and the lethal reality of her actual condition. While the sitcom character was dealing with the humorous pitfalls of counting calories or attending aerobic classes, Carter was quietly collapsing under a severe unmanaged cocaine addiction. The drug use was wreaking havoc on her cardiovascular system, accelerating the onset of severe chronic illnesses. The exhaustion she exhibited on set was not from the fictional diets written into the script. It was the physical toll of a massive narcotic dependency clashing with an unbearable production schedule. Yet the network maintained the facade by focusing the public's attention entirely on the highly visible, easily digestible issue of her weight. The production managed to construct a highly effective smokescreen. They gave the press and the audience something obvious to look at, ensuring no one looked closely enough to see the narcotic crisis that was threatening to kill the most profitable asset on their comedy roster. The reality of Hollywood in the early 1980s was inextricably linked to the rapid proliferation of cocaine. The drug had transitioned from a fringe narcotic to an industry standard, utilized by executives to fuel marathon boardroom sessions and by actors to sustain punishing production schedules. For Nell Carter, cocaine was not initially a recreational indulgence. It functioned as a chemical reinforcement. She was carrying the crushing weight of unresolved trauma, the isolation of sudden fame, and the physical demands of anchoring a multi-million-dollar television franchise. The drug offered a temporary artificial stamina. It provided the illusion of absolute control and boundless energy, allowing her to step onto the sound stage and project the booming, indestructible persona of Nell Harper. But this chemical crutch rapidly mutated into a catastrophic dependency. By the third season of Gimme a Break, Carter was entirely consumed by the addiction. Industry insiders and subsequent biographical reports estimate that at the peak of her usage, she was spending between $1,000 and $2,000 a day on cocaine. Funding a narcotic habit of that magnitude required a logistical infrastructure. $2,000 a day in the early 1980s equated to a massive volume of highly potent narcotics that had to be continuously procured, transported, and consumed, often within the confines of a highly secure NBC studio lot. They profited off her comedic talent on Thursday nights and profited off her psychological collapse in the Sunday papers. Carter was trapped in a system that squeezed every ounce of capital out of her existence, demanding that she perform while high, punishing her for the delay she caused, and quietly selling the story of her destruction to the highest bidder. The architecture of a Hollywood cover-up in the early 1980s relied entirely on the complicity of an ecosystem designed to protect corporate assets. When a television network discovers that the star of its highly profitable, family-friendly sitcom is suffering from a massive, escalating narcotic addiction, the crisis management protocols are immediately activated. The objective is never the physical rehabilitation of the human being. The objective is the preservation of the brand. For NBC, Nell Carter was a walking liability. Her severe cocaine dependency threatened not only the immediate production schedule of Gimme a Break, but also the massive future revenue generated by syndication rights. If the American public, deeply entrenched in the political rhetoric of the escalating war on drugs, discovered that the beloved maternal housekeeper of a primetime sitcom was burning through $2,000 of cocaine a day, the fallout would be catastrophic. Advertisers would pull their funding, affiliate stations would drop the broadcasts, and the franchise would become financially worthless overnight. The network needed a shield. They found the perfect airtight alibi in a genuine medical diagnosis. Nell Carter was legitimately diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. This was a factual, life-altering medical reality, exacerbated by her genetics, her severe weight fluctuations, and the extreme physical stress she placed on her body. However, the tragedy of this diagnosis lies in how it was instantly co-opted and weaponized by the network's public relations machinery. The diagnosis was not treated as a health crisis, requiring a production hiatus and intensive medical care. It was seized upon as a strategic miracle. Diabetes provided a clean, socially acceptable, and sympathetic explanation for every single symptom of her severe narcotic abuse. The PR department and the studio executives recognized that they could use a real disease to completely camouflage a fatal addiction. The mechanics of this smokescreen required meticulous daily execution. Carter's cocaine use resulted in a highly volatile physical state. The drug causes severe cardiovascular strain, manic behavioral shifts, profuse sweating, extreme dehydration, and sudden terrifying physical collapses when the body finally exhausts its artificial adrenaline. Whenever Carter suffered a medical emergency on set, when she fainted under the studio lights, when she was unable to remember her lines due to chemical impairment, or when her heart rate accelerated to dangerous levels, the set medics and private doctors on the studio payroll were deployed. These medical professionals were operating under the implicit understanding that their primary patient was the production schedule. When an ambulance was called or when Carter was rushed to a private hospital in Los Angeles, the press releases were already being drafted before she reached the emergency room. The public narrative was rigorously controlled. Network publicists issued official statements attributing her hospitalizations exclusively to complications from diabetes, blood sugar imbalances, or exhaustion related to her rigorous diet and shooting schedule. This was a masterclass in PR manipulation. It was a half-truth that legally protected the network from accusations of outright fabrication, while entirely burying the root cause of her physical destruction. The media and the public consumed this narrative without question. Diabetes was a relatable, common affliction. It transformed Carter from a volatile, out-of-control addict into a sympathetic, hard-working woman struggling valiantly against a chronic illness. The smokescreen worked perfectly. It allowed the network to maintain the wholesome, family-centric image of their sitcom, while their leading lady was literally fighting for her life in the grip of a massive chemical dependency. The complicity of the 1980s entertainment press was crucial to the success of this cover-up. This was an era defined by access journalism. Entertainment reporters, columnists, and tabloid editors relied entirely on the goodwill of the major networks and studio publicists to secure interviews, set visits, and exclusive scoops. To challenge the official PR narrative, to launch a serious investigative inquiry into the rumors of Carter's cocaine use would have meant immediate blacklisting by NBC. Journalists who pushed too hard would lose access to the network's entire roster of stars. Consequently, the press accepted the diabetes narrative at face value. This level of addiction does not happen in a vacuum. It requires an active network of enablers. Carter, utilizing her massive network salary, constructed a fortress of yes men, assistants, and associates whose primary function was to ensure an uninterrupted supply of the drug. She systematically isolated herself from colleagues and friends who attempted to intervene, viewing their concern as a threat to her supply. She weaponized her wealth and her status as the star of a hit show to insulate her addiction. If a crew member or a junior producer raised red flags about her erratic behavior, Carter possessed the power to have them removed from the set. She was the undisputed economic engine of the production, and she used that leverage to protect her self-destruction. Her personal accountability in this era cannot be understated. While the industry environment was inherently toxic, Carter was a wealthy, powerful adult who actively chose to prioritize the acquisition of cocaine over her professional obligations and her physical survival. She fired those who spoke the truth and hired those who facilitated the lie. The physical manifestation of this addiction on the set was impossible to conceal. Cocaine is a potent cardiovascular stimulant. For a woman already carrying excess weight and dealing with the latent markers of what would eventually be diagnosed as severe diabetes, the drug was systematically destroying her internal organs. She frequently arrived at the studio lot in the morning still under the influence from the previous night, severely sleep-deprived and physically depleted. The sharp, rapid-fire comedic timing that had won her a Tony Award began to disintegrate. She struggled to memorize her blocking, frequently missed her tape marks, and consistently forgot her dialogue. The burden of manufacturing a coherent television episode out of this chaos fell entirely on the supporting cast and the post-production crew. Actors like Dolph Sweet and the younger cast members were forced to adapt on the fly, feeding Carter her lines or improvising around her blown takes. The directors had to fundamentally alter their shooting style. Instead of capturing the kinetic, continuous energy of a live theatrical performance, they had to break the scenes down into fragmented, easily digestible shots. The editors in the cutting room worked exhaustive hours, splicing together microscopic fragments of usable footage to construct the illusion of a seamless comedic performance. The audience at home heard the canned laughter and saw a cohesive scene, entirely unaware that it was stitched together from dozens of failed, drug-addled takes. The network executives and the production company were fully aware of the crisis. Studio lots are small, highly communicative ecosystems. The daily production reports detailing hours of lost tape time, the massive budgets allocated for reshoots, and the first-hand accounts from the floor directors left no room for deniability. Yet the corporate response was not rooted in medical intervention or human compassion. It was driven exclusively by the production schedule and the advertising revenue. Internal communications and the prevailing operating procedures prioritized the delivery of the weekly master tape above all else. Shutting down the production to send the star to a comprehensive long-term rehabilitation facility was viewed as an unacceptable financial loss. The network chose a path of cynical complicity. They created a shadow schedule, building buffer days and extended rehearsal periods into the budget to accommodate her inevitable narcotic crashes. They essentially subsidized the inefficiency caused by her addiction because the final product was still generating a massive profit. More disturbingly, the production machinery began to weaponize the crisis as a form of stealth marketing. In the highly competitive landscape of 1980s television, controversy and morbid curiosity were powerful drivers of viewership. Rather than entirely suppressing the rumors of Carter's unraveling, there is evidence to suggest that producers and network publicists engaged in a calculated strategy of controlled leaks to the tabloid press. They fed the National Enquirer and other supermarket tabloids sanitized versions of her onset breakdowns, framing them as exhaustion or stress from the demands of stardom. This was a brilliant, deeply unethical content strategy. By acknowledging that the star was struggling, but deliberately obscuring the narcotic reality, they created a compelling off-screen narrative that drove on-screen ratings. The public tuned in out of a grim fascination, scrutinizing her physical appearance, looking for signs of fatigue, and waiting to see if the indestructible Nell Harper would finally crack on national television. The producers turned her very real descent into an addict's hell into a serialized drama for the press. They published the network-approved statements, ran sympathetic cover stories about her health battles, and actively participated in the erasure of her addiction. The press functioned as an unpaid extension of the NBC Public Relations Department, prioritizing access and industry relationships over journalistic integrity and the truth. This systemic cover-up forced Carter to live a grueling double life, compounding her psychological trauma. She was required to participate actively in the lie. During press junkets and talk show appearances, she was coached to speak at length about her diabetes management, her struggles with insulin, and her efforts to maintain a healthy lifestyle. For the sake of her fictional television family, she had to sit on national television, look directly into the camera, and solicit sympathy for a medical condition that the network was using to enable her self-destruction. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this facade was immense. She was acting both on-screen and off-screen, playing the role of the brave diabetic while privately negotiating the logistics of her next cocaine delivery. However, a multi-dimensional analysis requires acknowledging Carter's own complicity in this cover-up. The PR shield provided by the network was not a prison she was entirely forced into. It was a fortress she actively utilized to protect her addiction. Carter possessed the financial means and the agency to check herself into a specialized rehabilitation facility at any point during her tenure on the show. She chose not to. She utilized the diabetes and exhaustion narrative to deflect the genuine concerns of her family members, the few friends who managed to penetrate her inner circle, and the colleagues who attempted to stage interventions. When confronted about her erratic behavior or her obvious physical decline, she could hide behind the network-approved medical diagnosis. The lie was mutually beneficial. It protected the network's syndication revenue, and it protected Carter's uninterrupted access to the narcotics she believed she needed to survive the crushing pressure of her own fame. She allowed the system to exploit her disease because that exploitation funded her addiction. The physiological reality of combining massive daily doses of cocaine with unmanaged type 2 diabetes is a medical catastrophe. Cocaine severely restricts blood vessels and spikes blood pressure. Diabetes inherently damages the vascular system and impairs the body's ability to heal. By abusing cocaine while suffering from diabetes, Carter was subjecting her cardiovascular system to relentless, devastating trauma. The private physicians monitoring her on set were treating the immediate symptoms, administering fluids, attempting to stabilize her blood sugar, while fundamentally ignoring the massive quantities of narcotics she was ingesting. This was not health care. It was crisis management designed solely to keep a highly valuable asset upright until the director yelled cut on Friday night. The industry systematically ignored the lethal collision of these two conditions. Furthermore, the racial dynamics of the 1980s television industry played a significant unspoken role in the necessity of this cover-up. Carter was a black woman navigating an overwhelmingly white corporate structure. The margin for error was non-existent. White male executives and stars in Hollywood were frequently afforded the luxury of the troubled genius narrative, quietly sent to exclusive clinics in Palm Springs to dry out before returning to their careers. A black female sitcom star would not have been granted the same grace had the truth of her severe cocaine addiction been made public in the racially charged atmosphere of the 1980s war on drugs. She would have been swiftly and permanently vilified. She would have been stripped of her role, labeled a liability, and discarded by the industry entirely. The diabetes smokescreen was, in a brutal sense, the only viable survival strategy available to her within a system that demanded perfection from its black performers, while simultaneously driving them to the brink of collapse. This toxic symbiosis between a cynical network and a self-destructive star could only last as long as the sitcom remained profitable. But the illusion was about to shatter. The cancellation of Gimme a Break. In May 1987 was not just the end of a television production, it was the abrupt termination of a highly calibrated life support system. After 6 seasons and 137 episodes, the sitcom had naturally exhausted its narrative utility and its ratings dominance. NBC executives, adhering to standard industry practices, quietly pulled the plug. For the network, this was a routine business transaction, a simple clearing of the Thursday night grid to make room for newer, cheaper programming. For Nell Carter, the cancellation was a catastrophic destabilization. The studio lot had been her entire ecosystem. It provided her massive weekly salary, her daily structure, and, most crucially, the corporate public relations shield that had actively concealed her severe cocaine addiction from the American public. When the studio gates closed behind her for the final time, that protective machinery vanished instantly. She was no longer a highly valued, protected corporate asset. She was suddenly an unemployed, deeply traumatized addict operating without a safety net in a town that has zero tolerance for actors who are no longer generating profit. The financial reality of the television industry in the late 1980s was structurally designed to benefit the studios, not the talent. While Carter had commanded a massive weekly salary during the peak years of the show, the concept of long-term, lucrative syndication residuals for actors was largely non-existent. The massive profits generated when Gimme a Break was sold into global syndication went directly into the coffers of NBC and the production companies. Carter, like most actors of her era, received only a fraction of those back-end profits. Furthermore, her immediate gross income had been systematically dismantled before it ever reached her bank account. Standard industry deductions, agent fees, management commissions, public relations retainers, and aggressive taxation routinely claimed more than 50% of an actor's gross earnings. However, the primary architect of Carter's impending financial ruin was Carter herself. The money that survived the industry deductions was not placed into trusts, diversified investments, or conservative savings accounts. It was rapidly liquidated to sustain a lifestyle she could no longer afford and a narcotic dependency that demanded constant massive infusions of cash. The daily expenditure of thousands of dollars on cocaine during the production years had established a baseline of spending that she could not abruptly halt just because the NBC paycheck stopped. She had constructed an expensive fortress of enablers, assistants, and properties, and the overhead costs of maintaining that illusion remained static while her income plummeted. She was entirely responsible for her failure to secure her own financial future. The industry paid her millions. She made the active daily choice to burn it. When Carter attempted to transition back into the workforce after 1987, she encountered a brutal silent blockade. Hollywood operates on a highly efficient whisper network. While the American public still viewed her as the lovable Nell Harper, the casting directors, producers, and showrunners in Los Angeles knew the unvarnished truth. The reports of her on-set volatility, the screaming matches with Dolph Sweet and Rosie O'Donnell, the hours of delayed production time, and the chronic drug-induced exhaustion were open secrets within the executive suites. She had a reputation as a massive liability. In the clinical arithmetic of television production, hiring an actor with a known history of severe substance abuse and erratic set behavior is an unacceptable financial risk. Bond companies, which insure film and television productions against delays, would likely flag her involvement, driving up the cost of production to prohibitive levels. Consequently, the phone stopped ringing. The offers for leading television roles evaporated. She was effectively blacklisted not for political reasons, but for purely economic ones. She was reduced to taking sporadic minor guest appearances on other sitcoms or accepting roles in lower-tier television movies just to maintain a cash flow. This professional rejection coincided violently with the most devastating personal tragedy of her adult life. As the 1980s drew to a close, the United States was entirely engulfed by the HIV/AIDS epidemic. The crisis hit the entertainment industry and the marginalized communities of New York and Los Angeles with devastating force. In 1989, the epidemic struck Carter directly. Her older brother, Bernard Hardy, was diagnosed with the virus. Bernard was not merely a sibling. He was the absolute core of her remaining emotional support system. In a life defined by childhood abandonment, fractured trust, and the transactional relationships of Hollywood, Bernard was the one constant, reliable anchor. He had been her confidant, her protector, and her link to a reality outside the toxic bubble of fame. The medical reality of AIDS in 1989 was a death sentence. There were no effective antiretroviral therapies available. The decline was rapid, physically agonizing, and heavily stigmatized. Carter was forced to watch the total physical destruction of the only person she truly trusted. She assumed the role of caretaker, utilizing her remaining financial resources to secure medical care in an era when many hospitals and doctors actively discriminated against AIDS patients. The financial cost of his care accelerated her own bankruptcy, but the psychological cost was absolute. When Bernard Hardy died in 1989, the last remaining pillar of Carter's emotional foundation collapsed. The grief was not something she could process or manage. It was a total system failure. The death of her brother removed any remaining incentive Carter had to maintain her sobriety or her career. The early 1990s became a grim inventory of physical and financial degradation. The severe unmanaged diabetes, compounded by years of heavy cocaine abuse, began to systematically destroy her internal organs. In 1992, she suffered a near-fatal medical emergency when she required emergency surgery to repair 2 ruptured aneurysms. The surgical interventions were invasive, highly dangerous, and required extensive, prolonged periods of recovery. These medical crises entirely derailed any momentum she had attempted to build in her career. She was physically incapable of meeting the grueling demands of a theatrical run or a television shooting schedule. The medical bills from the surgeries, the intensive care stays, and the ongoing specialized treatments for her diabetes were astronomical. In the American healthcare system, severe chronic illness combined with surgical emergencies guarantees rapid financial depletion. For a woman who was already living far beyond her means and lacking a steady television income, these medical debts were the final blow. Her creditors began aggressive collections. The IRS launched investigations into unpaid back taxes from her peak earning years. The massive Beverly Hills estate, the luxury vehicles, and the trappings of her 1980s stardom became legal liabilities, targeted for seizure. The culmination of this downward trajectory arrived in 1995. Stripped of her television empire, physically broken by surgeries and addiction, and grieving the total loss of her family structure, Nell Carter was forced to publicly surrender to her creditors. She formally filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It was a humiliating, highly publicized legal admission of total financial collapse. The court filings laid bare the reality of her situation. The millions of dollars she had earned at NBC were entirely gone. The documents detailed massive debts to the federal government, exorbitant medical bills, and a complete lack of liquid assets. The bankruptcy court effectively took control of her remaining finances, liquidating whatever she had left to satisfy her creditors. The indestructible sitcom star, the woman whose face had generated millions of dollars in advertising revenue just a decade prior, was now legally recognized as destitute. The Hollywood machine had extracted her youth, her health, and her talent, and when she finally broke under the pressure, the industry simply looked away, leaving her to face the brutal arithmetic of bankruptcy court entirely alone. The legal reality of emerging from a Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the mid-1990s offered no clean slate. It simply reorganized the debt and left the debtor to face an industry that had already calculated her exact expiration date. Nell Carter was stripped of her lucrative television contracts, her Beverly Hills real estate, and the corporate protection she had relied upon for a decade. She was in her late 40s, carrying the profound physical damage of chronic substance abuse and unmanaged diabetes. Yet, she could not retreat into quiet retirement. The necessity of generating immediate liquid cash forced her to return to the precise environment that had originally broken her, the grueling, physically punitive theater circuit. She attempted to engineer a comeback by returning to her roots on the stage, but the Broadway of the late 1990s was entirely different from the landscape she had conquered in 1978. In 1997, Carter secured the role of Miss Hannigan in the high-profile Broadway revival of the musical Annie. On paper, it was a logical casting decision, capitalizing on her massive voice and her established comedic timing. In execution, it was a severe miscalculation of her physical capabilities. The demands of a Broadway production require an actor to perform 8 heavily choreographed shows a week. There is no editing room, no stunt double, and no opportunity to pause a live performance to manage a blood sugar crash. Carter's body was simply incapable of sustaining this pace. The years of severe cocaine dependency had critically accelerated the hardening of her arteries, while her type 2 diabetes severely restricted her circulation and slowed her recovery time. Theater critics, unaware or uncaring of her underlying medical reality, were brutal in their assessments. Reviews frequently noted her visible lethargy on stage, criticizing her lack of energy and the noticeable decline in her vocal power. The industry had moved on, and she was publicly failing to keep up with the physical demands of her own profession. Compounding this intense physical strain was a massive, entirely voluntary increase in her personal responsibilities. During the exact period when her career was destabilizing and her health was failing, Carter made the conscious decision to expand her family. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, she adopted 2 infant boys, Joshua and Daniel. While the desire for a family following the death of her brother was understandable, the reality of this choice must be examined objectively. She took on the lifelong financial and emotional burden of raising 2 children in Los Angeles, while her income was plummeting and her medical bills were skyrocketing. This was a profound personal choice, and she was entirely accountable for the resulting pressure. The financial overhead of raising 2 sons meant she could never afford to take a hiatus to prioritize her failing health. The rent had to be paid, the children had to be fed, and the medical debt had to be serviced. This relentless financial pressure forced her to accept any available gig, no matter how physically draining or creatively unfulfilling, essentially working herself into the ground to sustain a life she had independently chosen to build. By the early 2000s, the momentum of the Annie revival had entirely dissipated, leaving Carter to rely on sporadic, low-paying guest appearances on television shows and regional theater productions. These jobs did not offer the massive upfront salaries of a network sitcom. They offered standard union scale, which was immediately consumed by her outstanding debts and daily living expenses. The arithmetic of her life was fundamentally broken. Her outgoings consistently and massively exceeded her incomings. This relentless financial bleed culminated in a second highly public financial collapse. In 2002, she filed for bankruptcy for the second time, this time under Chapter 13. Filing for a second bankruptcy within a 7-year period in the entertainment industry is a definitive statement of chronic unbankability. It signals to producers, casting directors, and bond companies that the individual is entirely insolvent and represents a massive financial liability. The court filings from this 2002 bankruptcy were stark and unforgiving. She listed her total assets as negligible, comprising a few $1,000s in personal property, against a mountain of overwhelming, unmanageable liabilities. She was a working actor with a Tony and an Emmy to her name, yet she was legally recognized as completely destitute. The court assumed control of her remaining finances, establishing a strict court-mandated repayment plan that siphoned off whatever meager income she managed to generate. Entering 2003, Carter was not a retired icon enjoying the legacy of her past success. She was a woman in her early 50s, fighting a desperate, losing battle for basic survival. She was legally sober during these final years. Toxicology reports and accounts from close associates confirmed that she had ceased her abuse of illegal narcotics. However, this sobriety arrived far too late to reverse the catastrophic structural damage inflicted upon her body. Decades of heavy cocaine use had fundamentally altered the architecture of her cardiovascular system. The drug causes severe, prolonged constriction of the blood vessels, forcing the heart to pump against immense, unnatural pressure. When combined with the systemic vascular damage caused by her chronic diabetes, the result was severe arteriosclerotic heart disease. Her arteries were thickened, hardened, and dangerously narrow. She was a woman of 54 operating with the internal organs of someone decades older. Despite her failing physical state, the pressure of the bankruptcy court, and the necessity of providing for her 2 teenage sons forced her to continue working. In January 2003, she was simultaneously involved in an independent film project titled Swing, and was actively rehearsing for a stage production of the musical Raisin in Long Beach, California. Eyewitness accounts from these final rehearsals paint a grim picture. Carter was visibly exhausted, struggling to cross the rehearsal room and breathing heavily after minimal exertion. She was requiring frequent breaks and was clearly operating at the absolute limit of her physical endurance. Yet she pushed her failing heart day after day, driven by the immediate, unyielding need for a paycheck. The end did not arrive on a Hollywood soundstage or under the lights of a Broadway theater. It arrived quietly behind the closed doors of her home in Beverly Hills. On the evening of January 22, 2003, Carter went to sleep. Sometime in the early morning hours of January 23rd, her severely compromised cardiovascular system simply stopped functioning. She suffered a massive, fatal cardiac event. The discovery of her body the following morning was a stark, quiet tragedy. It was not a manager or studio executive who found her. It was her 13-year-old son, Joshua. She was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 54 years old. The subsequent investigation by the Los Angeles County Department of Medical Examiner coroner was clinical and definitive. The official autopsy report listed the cause of death as probable arteriosclerotic heart disease, with diabetes explicitly noted as a significant contributing condition. The toxicology screening confirmed the final tragic irony of her life. She was entirely free of illicit drugs at the time of her death. She had finally managed to stop consuming the narcotics that defined her darkest years, but the internal damage was irreversible. The autopsy provided a final, irrefutable medical accounting of a body that had been pushed past the point of structural failure. The financial accounting of her death was equally stark. When Nell Carter's estate entered the probate courts of Los Angeles County, the legal ledger of her life was finalized. The public, who still largely remembered her as the booming, indestructible sitcom star of the 1980s, assumed she had died a wealthy woman. The reality recorded in the court documents was devastating. After all the creditors were satisfied, the back taxes were settled, and the bankruptcy protocols were executed, the final liquid assets of Nell Carter were tallied. The woman who had generated tens of millions of dollars in advertising revenue, who had carried an entire network comedy lineup on her back, and who had sacrificed her physical health to an unforgiving industry, left behind a bank account containing exactly $200. Nell Carter's life demands a rigorous, unsentimental examination. She was a performer of undeniable explosive talent who utilized her raw survival instincts to escape severe poverty and profound early trauma, reaching the absolute pinnacle of the American entertainment industry. Her career stands as a clear indictment of a corporate studio system that systematically commodifies human beings, extracts their talent for maximum profit, and abandons them the moment their physical or psychological frailties threaten the production schedule. The network was fully complicit in enabling her destruction, weaponizing her medical reality to shield their financial interests. However, her story is equally defined by her own severe lack of personal accountability. She weaponized her wealth to insulate her massive narcotic addiction, alienated those who attempted to intervene, and made highly destructive financial and personal choices that guaranteed her eventual ruin. The tragedy of Nell Carter is not simply that Hollywood destroyed her. It is that she actively participated in her own destruction within a system entirely designed to let her fall. Her legacy is a permanent factual record of the brutal collision between immense talent, unresolved human trauma, and the unforgiving arithmetic of show business.